All right, hello. Welcome to our lunch break study at Congregation Beth Sholom. As always, I'm Rabbi Ain. It's nice to see you. What I wanted to do on this Wednesday, I was just saying it's a little bit rainy and it's a little bit sunny, both simultaneously. It's either too sunny or too rainy. So on a day like today, I thought it might be nice to continue our discussion of Rabbi Kaplan and about the nature of Judaism, and to talk, as we've been talking, as we are entering into our second, about what will Judaism look like when we return? What will Judaism look like post-COVID? And I wanted to begin with just a question to ask all of you before we get into the text and everything. So what do you think is the ritual that you have missed the most? So what is the ritual that you have missed the most that we have not been able to do during the past year? And why do you think you've missed it? So I wanted to begin with that question. Take time. Yeah, Ellen.
For me, it's when the Torah goes around the congregation.
Yeah, why?
There's just something very moving to me about being near the Torah and knowing that it's in my heart and my mind, and it's so close to me.
Thank you. I'm taking notes. Lovely. Other things that you've missed at the shul, missed from coming together. You know, Don or Marv or Dara.
I missed me. It's not a very ritualistic, but I missed some.
Kiddush.
Well, even before Kiddush, just saying hello to old friends.
Yeah, just meeting people, seeing people, being together. Anything ritual, Howard, that you miss? Anything ritually significant, an aspect of our services or our rituals that you really been missing out this past year?
I'm smiling when I say this, and I'm actually missing the daily minyan.
Yeah, why? Tell me why.
Well, it's a smaller group, and it's people I've become friends with, and I looked forward to them. I'm, as most people know, I'm not a very religious man, but and I went to daily minyan because of death in the family, and then I got caught up in the people there and why they were there. And I may not have had the same reasons a lot of them did, but being there made me feel like I was part of something.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the presence, being around others, feel like you're a part of something. What about you, Gary?
So, Howard, we welcome you at Morning Minyan, and I have to say that is not the thing I miss. I mean, we have Morning Minyan 6 days a week, and it's more vibrant than ever. We've gotten a minyan every single day in the last month, from as low as 13 to as many as 25. It's very gratifying, and we are together, and it's wonderful. I have to second Ellen. It's Shabbat morning, full Kriyah is what I miss. And that I have found no way to replace. And the fact that Torah is central to our lives and that we've been excluded to that. The pain is, I thought it would help that now that we do a Torah reading, during Minyan Monday and Thursday, but it just cements that hole that we don't have a full Kriyah on Saturday morning. And I don't know anyone who does that, who does Saturday morning services live, has a full Kriyah. They may do Torah, but the triennial cycle, it leaves me cold.
Good. Yeah, let's take a minute and talk about that ritual, the ritual of reading the entire Torah portion. What does that mean to you? What does that do for you? What does it symbolize? I'm curious. Kaplan is going to ask us to do all these things in a moment.
The symbol is straightforward. I mean, Torah is central to our lives, and if on Shabbat we say we don't have enough time to read Torah, I don't know what we stand for as Jews. I mean, it's that black and white for me. I mean, that's why we're there, and we're there to, I mean, I think our goal, you know, I mean, different people have different things, but I'd say our goal is to grow in Torah, and whatever that means to each individual may be different, but we get that when we study. I mean,
Let me ask you, can I just ask you a follow-up?
Okay.
Does it matter the language?
Not necessarily, but well, yeah, I mean, I think hearing it in Hebrew does matter to me because I do get a different resonance. I mean, I'll say, like, for example, last week's, you know, Rabbi Russell took a very different take on, I mean, almost every rabbi has the same on the golden calf, and Panim al Panim has the same take, that it's not being seen for who you are by others. And it was just, it was fascinating to hear her take, which was not allowing yourself to be seen. And so that was like totally unique. I mean, I'd heard the other one from hundreds of, so I mean, yeah, it's nice when you get a good Devar Torah, but you know, I must admit, a lot of times when the Kriya is going on, I don't pay attention to that so much, and I read the whole text, and I have that half hour or so to study on my own what's there. I compare the Hebrew to the English. All of that is part of Shabbat morning for me.
Beautiful. Now, tell me, what is it about the full reading that is significant for you? I'm curious. Is it the completeness of it? Is it the shalem nature of that we read every word?
Exactly. It's about Judaism, about a cycle. I mean, we have the cycle of the calendar, whether it's Rosh Chodesh or, you know, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and that's completed in that we complete the Torah every year. And reading an excerpt seems like we're saying, well, we don't have the time for the whole thing. Parts don't matter.
Thank you, Gary. So for some of you who are coming late arriving, I'm just asking people to share what's the one ritual that they miss the most that we haven't been able to do as a community during this past year. Judah.
Yeah, it's not an answer to that question, but I just wanted to say that on Shabbos morning, I davened with B'nai Yeshurun in New York City. And you know, I'm sure they're unaffiliated, but it's definitely a conservative service, almost all in Hebrew. And their evolution over COVID has been, they started out not reading Torah.
Yep.
They had the service without it, and now they read the full Torah every Shabbos.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've experienced something similar as Gary was talking about. We've unexpectedly had a vibrant morning minyan. We started just a couple of days a week, and now we're every day. Other rituals that people have missed, Marv or Sandy or Dara or Don or Susan, what is a ritual that over this past year you've really missed?
I don't think it's any particular ritual for me. It's just being together and davening and just sort of being in the space.
Yeah, so I think that's really good. There's something about sacred space,
yeah,
that is significant to some of us, and sometimes that space is because of historical reasons. We had our bat mitzvah there, or sometimes the space is about coming together with people that you love and you want to be in that shared space. So there is a part of Jewish ritual, obviously, as Howard said, not being able to come to the minyan every day in physical presence. That involves gathering, right? This week's Torah portion is Vayakel, right? It's all about gathering the community together to a large part. Susan, what have you missed during this past year?
I think biggest part is just actually seeing the physical Torah scroll.
Tell me why. What does that represent? What does that mean to you?
I mean, that represents everything that what Judaism is about. And this, the scroll to me is just so magical and brings so much joy.
What if I just, can I just screen share a picture of a parchment for you? I mean, would that do it, Susan?
No.
Well, tell me why not.
I mean, really one of my favorite holidays is Simchat Torah, and just you know, taking the scrolls out and just the joy that brings to see them physically. It's hard for me to describe.
Yeah, it might not be something we can put into words. Thank you. Beautiful.
Can I follow on? Can I follow on Susan's thing?
Sure,
And that, you know, it's weird, and I'm almost embarrassed because I feel it's almost idolatrous. But you know, it's nishma v'naseh, and so hearing it is wonderful, and I enjoy that we do that in Minyan. Ikar has started with something. Their production values are just tremendous. They have Torah cam for when they have Torah readings, and they actually have, you see the yad moving across while the B'nai Mitzvah kid is laning or something. And it's a very weird experience, but it is very moving. And I can't tell you how much the first time I saw it, it moved me.
All right, thank you, Gary. All right.
I might add that talking about their tech abilities, before the high holidays, Rabbi Bruce made an appeal for just a few donors, you know, which he knows are in the congregation, that could each donate $25,000 for their to get them up to tech standards. She says, I know you're in the congregation, so just a few of you. That's all.
Well, you know, that's great. That's a wonderful, strong community. Alana.
Oh, well, I would want to just say, I mean, I feel so comforted that we can do this. I mean, I'm grateful that we have this, and I don't want to, you know, in any way discount that. But I of course, I miss being together physically in the space. But one of the things that I miss about that is just kind of like where I can kind of be in the back sometimes. Like I sometimes don't want to be like this head and face that everyone can see. It was what Rabbi Russell addressed. I think it was her Devar Torah on Friday about like her rabbi, or was it, which rabbi was it? One of the,
Elliot Dorff.
yes, and how he had this very vulnerable, emotional moment on the Zoom, and how that's, sometimes I don't want that. I sometimes want to just like, I just want to be in the back of the chapel crying, and if I want, and someone will come and hug me, and that's good, but I don't need everyone to see my crying face. I just want to be like with part of the group and not up front in the group. And that's one thing that I really miss about being in physical space together. I did have it once where there was a bat mitzvah that I was able to attend on the plaza, and that was just one of my favorite things, like just being in the back. I mean, we're still so conspicuous. My kids, obviously, our kids are like running around. They had maracas at this one. There was like a lot going on, and the Ains we definitely stood out, but we were in the back, and I just like sitting with the group and just being with the group.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I'm in an unusual circumstance being the rabbi, so it's hard to hide as the rabbi. But you know, somebody had said to me when I first arrived here that Rabbi Lou used to come to the minyan, a blessed memory, used to come to the minyan, just sit in the back and daven in the morning. And for me, that's like, oh my God, my heart swells at the thought of being able to do something like that. So let's go take a look at Kaplan. And let's see what he has to say to us. So first of all, this comes from his book, The Future of the American Jew. And what he's going to analyze is, well, what do we do what we do? And to understand our ritual usage. And I just thought that as we enter, we're in this new era. Gary's talking about we're creating new minyanim, new, you know, these yad cam, right? We've got yad cams now. So the ritual usage is changing. We're all going to come back in person at some point, hopefully very soon. And my question is, what will the ritual look like then? And what do we want it to look like? So I want to enter into this Rabbi Kaplan a little bit, and let's see what we think about his approach. And I find that the longer I am in this COVID world, the more Kaplanian I become. So the need for a point of view on Jewish usage, even without exact statistical studies, it is fairly obvious that this, let me just give you the year on this. This is 1948. 1948. Even without exact statistical studies, it is fairly obvious that the practice of religious ceremonials and rituals is rapidly declining among American Jews. Those who wish to ignore the obvious can still point with satisfaction to crowded metropolitan synagogues, to food corporations catering to the demand for kosher products, and to young people's organizations dedicated to the observance of Shabbat. An optimistic appraisal of the status of Jewish observance, however, indicates a refusal to face the simple fact that the overwhelming majority of American Jews have already cast aside such Jewish institutions as daily prayer, kashrut, and the Shabbat, which have undeniably played an important part in traditional Jewish religion. The main streets of every Jewish community in America bear testimony to the blatant abandonment of Jewish ritual usage. This rejection is moreover characteristic not only of the Jew, who has grown to maturity without religious home training or under the influence of a reformed temple, it is equally true of that vast greater number of Jews who are the products of Orthodox homes. So the complete elimination of all Jewish rituals would render Jewish survival difficult, if not impossible. In the light of what we know of the past, there is no reason to regard their complete elimination as inevitable. Jewish history records a number of instances in which the masses were won back to Jewish practices after they had neglected them. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that a concerted effort on the part of religious leaders could, in this cataclysmic era in Jewish life, stem the tide of desecration which is sweeping away the sanctities gathered from the long and bitter experiences of the Jewish people. Okay, so his setup is not that different from us today. People are keeping kosher less, people are observing less, and it's not impossible if the current age, like maybe 48, is cataclysmic as well, that we might be optimistic about our ability to reinvigorate Jewish ritual and to bring more people back to it. So he's entering into this from an optimistic perspective as to try to bring people back to the faith. To deal with the economic, social, and ideological factors which account for the breakdown of the traditional way of life, something more is needed than repeated homiletical harangues urging Jews to remain loyal to their heritage. There is little that official rabbinical and synagogical groups can do to remove the almost insurmountable economic and social obstacles which American life places in the path of those who want to continue a maximum observance of the traditional rites. Certainly that's all the case today. Jewish laymen might, however, have expected from their religious leaders an ideological orientation which would enable them to meet the challenge of the American environment. But instead of formulating such a guide, most of our leaders have persisted in demanding devotion to a past, which is rapidly becoming more and more nebulous for an increasing number of Jews. Why should one observe this or that ceremony? And what is its religious or social significance? It is precisely these questions that demand an answer. Any program designed to revive the observance of Jewish rites will have to provide a rationale for such ritual usage. Moreover, such a program will have to indicate along what lines traditional practices may be changed and new practices instituted without endangering the entire structure of Jewish religious life. So unless a rationale for ritual and a guide for its modification is formulated in the near future, we will lose so much of the momentum of the past as to nullify the possibility of a revival in Jewish religious practice. The possibility of affirmative adjustment recedes with every passing day. I don't know if I agree with that last line, but I agree with most of the rest of it and feel this time is very similar to the time that Rabbi Kaplan is talking about. I feel I am currently being flooded with requests and interests from relatives of my wife to other people who are in their 20s and their 30s who are looking for a way back or something solid or a connection to their tradition during this unsettling time period. And I do think that, do I think it's true that ritual observance is decreasing still today? Yeah, I would say so. I would say so. I'm not sure ritual observance is on the upswing from what I've seen.
Can you expand maybe on that?
Fewer people are keeping kosher. Fewer people are keeping Shabbat. Fewer people are having Passover Seders. Fewer people are fasting on Yom Kippur. That's what I mean.
See, it's interesting because you come from a different background than, say, I do, or many others. I mean, I come from the first generation of Jews who kind of left that stuff. And, our parents' generation did everything they could to, flee all those strictures. I mean, my father went to a Talmud Torah and everything, and all he had was positive things to say about it, but didn't want anything to do with a synagogue. And then it comes that someone like me is so devoted to increasing in Jewish ritual. Even my sister, who is not at my level, still the synagogue, is the center of her life still. And it's not true of my brothers, but I mean, it is true that we're there. And I think for a lot of others of our generation, whose parents fled, there was like a bottoming, and people will say, well, what does it mean? And some, you're right, have disappeared. But I think for others, they're looking to reclaim ritual. And I think that's why, in part, that's why things like, egalitarian halakhic, the Hadar model, has been so powerful. I think that's part.
Well, he does kind of address your point here, in which he says above that you really can't look at what's happening in the metropolises. Yes, you'll have these instances in the various metropolises which are successful, but on the whole, I don't find Jewish ritual on the upswing.
It doesn't, almost by definition, Judaism needs some form of metropolis. It needs some core. I mean, you can't say my religious observance of Judaism is going to be core to me and then move someplace where there's no Jewish community to support the things needed for Jewish ritual.
Well, yeah, and the reason for that is because the other places that used to be able to support Jewish ritual aren't able to do it any longer because fewer people are practicing Jewish.
Right. But it's like the joke in, Manhattan now, everyone's talking about Brooklyn because, Brooklyn was always Jewish, but it's even more so now.
Well, I see your point. I definitely understand your point. But yet I do feel like you're unique. I think you would have to acknowledge your uniqueness. And I would say like the large swath of people, the numbers of unaffiliated, the numbers who don't know Jewish ritual, who didn't grow up with Jewish ritual. I mean, a lot of the people I'm talking to were born after 1990. I mean, they might not have grown up with the same sort of emphasis on Jewish community and Jewish ritual. And therefore, it's diminishing. But at the same point, I do believe that what Rabbi Kaplan is saying is on point. There is this return that is happening. And the question is, how do we serve that return? Do we say, well, you have to do it just like the way it was done 30 years ago that you wanted to have nothing to do with? Are you returning to that? Or are we asking people to come and be a part of something that is going to be meaningful in this time for them? I think ultimately that, and what Kaplan is putting forth is like, we have to have a reason why we're doing this ritual other than because it was done. Because if the only reason we have is because this is why it was done, then we're going to lose this unique opportunity to draw people closer to our faith and to our community. Judah.
Yeah, I think one thing, if to stem the tide, one big thing facing the conservative movement, which could help stem the tide, is the interfaith marriage. And that I think will stop people from leaving, not only stop people from leaving, but it will bring people in. And I mean, from my experience, I think for most people, quite often the convert is more religious than the original Jew. So that could be helpful.
Yeah, no,
they decide.
I think it's a real problem. I think there are halachic, as well as historical, as well as particular to each particular congregation, that leads subsequent generations to not want to have anything to do with it. And one of my jobs is to help people clear some of those hurdles and those stumbling blocks that are put in the way for their reentry into Jewish life, because they're real. And there are a lot of blocks that people have, no matter how much even they love me or they love my wife or they love all of you. This idea of affiliating with a conservative community, it's not the easiest thing to them. It doesn't come naturally.
When I was at Beth Sholom, there was a really wonderful couple who were there all the time, and she was not Jewish, and she was there as often as he was, and she was allowed to open the Ark with him. She was not allowed to join. And so they eventually left Beth Sholom because she could not be a member.
Yeah. So that's no longer the case. So the bylaws has been changed since that instance happened. So if someone would approach with the same exact situation, that would not be the case today. And this is part of what Kaplan is talking about, which is how do we get rid of those things that may not, I'm not saying that rule doesn't serve a value. I'm just saying, what are the obstacles and the barriers that have meaning and value because they enhance the ritual experience? And what are those things that are relics of the past that won't help us meet where we're going? So let's see how Kaplan wants to break this down for us. So the attitudes of neo-Orthodoxy and conservatism. He says we cannot look to reform for guidance in these problems. The philosophy of reform, at least in its classical formulation, deliberately rejected many valuable religious usages. The Declaration of Principles, adopted at the Memorial Pittsburgh Conference in 1885, retained, in addition to the moral elements of the Mosaic legislation, only such ceremonies as were both edifying and compatible with modern conditions. Okay, that's not, I guess, so Kaplan is critical here. So he's not looking for ceremonies that are merely edifying and compatible with modern conditions for the type of his reconstruction. In as much as reform held modern conditions to demand the denationalization of Jewish life, compatibility with those conditions involved the elimination of all ritual usage that had nationalistic or separatistic implications. They specifically discarded kashrut, took great liberties with the liturgy, relaxed the observance on Shabbat and the holidays, and only mildly discountenanced intermarriage. The entire program of change cannot be significant for those who consciously set out to alter radically the pattern of Jewish life. In Reform Judaism, as it has functioned until recently and still functions in most Reformed congregations, the Torah is, and this is exactly what Susan was talking about, the significance of the Torah, and Gary too. Here he's saying in Reformed congregations, the Torah is in effect reduced to the abstraction of a moral law and ceases to serve as an all-embracing guide for everyday living. Classical Reform retained, to be sure, some of the traditional ceremonies, but it retained them only as a means of symbolizing moral principles in concrete forms, or of arousing sentiments of unity among Jews as co-religionists. More recently, many Reform rabbis have accepted Jewish peoplehood and have consequently been led to introduce much more of Jewish ritual. This is true here. Nevertheless, they have not yet, any more than the other religious groups, articulated a satisfying rationale for perpetuating and developing Jewish ritual usage. Unlike the old line reformists, the Zionist element within Reform is confronted with the need of formulating principles that should guide Jewish ritual usage. All right, so he's saying here we can't really use the Reform as a model for how we're to proceed because they've pretty much cast off Torah to just be this moral guide, and all of to the extent that it doesn't serve that purpose and that it serves to separate us or perhaps give us a notion of being a part of one nation, they've removed that. Now, from the standpoint of orthodoxy, there is a ready answer to the question, why retain Jewish ceremonial? So Reform can't answer the question, why do we retain Jewish ceremonies? But Kaplan says the Orthodox have no problem with that question. Jewish observances must be maintained because God ordained them. The decline of ritual observance fails to perturb Orthodox thinkers. They're not really bothered by the decline. They argue that in every generation, some reject God's law If the sinners do not turn penitent, and if they eventually sever the last link binding them to Israel and Israel's God, there will still be a Sha'ar Yeshov, a saving remnant. There'll still be that remnant. And who says that Israel must be numbered in the millions? God can accomplish God's ends and fulfill the destiny of the Jewish people through a loyal remnant. And so from that standpoint, any change in Jewish usage is precluded because such usage is part of the immutable divine law given to Israel at Mount Sinai. Every prohibition and every positive injunction is a mitzvah, God's direct command to the individual Jew. And there is no essential difference from the Orthodox point of view between a biblical commandment, a Talmudic regulation, and the last responsum of an authorized contemporary halachist. All are Torah and therefore not susceptible to abrogation or amendment. All right, so that we have these two poles here. Now, this rationale for religious usage and this attitude towards change failed to satisfy anyone unable to accept the doctrine that the minutiae of the Torah are of supernatural origin. So if we can't accept that the minutiae of the Torah are supernatural, then this Orthodox rationale is probably not going to work for us. The non-observance of many who give lip service to the Orthodox, so of course, maybe you know some people who are part of Orthodox shul, but perhaps don't practice. He's saying this fact indicates that their faith no longer actually functions in their lives, since few men would have the boldness consistently to violate what they really believe with perfect faith. All right, that's unfair. I don't know, that's kind of unfair. All right, let's now move down to conservative Jews. Conservative Jews who rebel instinctively against the laxity of Reformed Jewish practice and find themselves unable to accept the intransigence of orthodoxy have developed another theory to explain their own refusal to relax the rigidity of Jewish ritual observance. In the interest of preserving historical Judaism, it is claimed we must uphold the entire body of traditional practices. Once we remove the barriers, there is no end to the process of disintegration. No matter what lamentable hardship the law may work on an individual Jew, he may properly be asked in the name of loyalty to sacrifice this well-being to the group. Like orthodoxy, conservatives frequently insist that change can be introduced only through authoritative interpretation of the existing codes. We've studied this Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards. And there can be no innovation and no abrogation, since it is obviously undesirable that each Jew become a law unto himself. The tendency of the great majority of Jews to take the law into their own hands does not alarm such conservatives any more than it perturbs the Orthodox. The conservative is likely to interpret the law strictly in order to counterbalance the popular tendency to take liberties with ritual regulations. Conservatism has an absolute faith in a Jewish future and will presumably be prepared to accept the practice of the majority of Jews once that practice has crystallized and become authoritative, but it will take only a minor part in guiding and channeling the change. Its sole contribution to the molding of the Jewish future is to cling fast to the codes and the standards of the past. So that's a heavy critique on the conservative movement. Ellen.
So I have a question here. I don't really know what the practice is here, but I know that my friends in New Orleans would be conservative Jews, but they would keep kosher only in their homes and not when they went out.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the practice is here either. You'd have to ask the people here.
That sounds like a fun practice. No.
I just mentioned.
I mean, I take it for the fact, Ellen, that there is no kosher restaurant in San Francisco. All of those are leading indicators to me that these things are not at the top of the priority. And I would say, and there's no judgment here. I don't think kashrut, if I were to take a survey of congregants of Beth Sholom, I don't think kashrut would fall on the top. If I asked them to list their top 5 Jewish values, I think very few of them would list kashrut in the top 5. So, and by the way, you guys are all welcome to disagree with me here. Anybody who wants to disagree with me, but that's my bet. Stuart, did you want to say something? You're not in San Francisco. Did you want to say something? You're muted.
in New York, we have a lot of kosher establishments and restaurants, and I think even more more and more. And there is a kosher place in downtown San Francisco that is in danger of going out of business, according to the J. Sabra, what do they call it?
Yeah.
Sabra. Yeah.
But
But
what's the story, Sandy?
Yeah. No. We're being recorded. Don't say anything.
Oh.
We'll see what. Leave it be, Dad. Leave it be. But let me ask you something. In New York, are more people Jewishly observant now than when you moved out to Long Island in 1976?
Yes.
More people keep kosher on Long Island. More people go to shul.
Yeah, certainly during this pandemic, we have everything is online, and we have. I'm just amazed at how many people come online for the shul, for the services.
So, Dad, you attended shul every day of your life from the time you moved to Long Island. Now, what do you miss most?
Nothing.
That you have not been able to participate in?
Oh, reading Torah. That our rabbi won't let me read Torah unless he brings the Torah over to the house, and he said he was going to do it. I'm still waiting.
So you miss hearing the Torah?
No, we have no. If you go to the shul, there are people.
So there is. Let me ask you something. Is there anything that you cannot get in that little room of yours that you miss that you got at the Dix Hills Jewish Center?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
No, it's even better because I can just roll out of bed and I'm in shul.
It's unbelievable.
Rabbi.
By the way, this was not the father I grew up with, by the way. Judah.
All this talk about, people showing up for Minyan, and indeed here, I go to evening Minyan here in Sacramento, and sometimes we had trouble making a Minyan. Every night now they're getting 20 or 30. I'm a little apprehensive about what's going to happen when they have to drive to shul to go. So I'm not so enthralled with this idea that people are showing up for services. They're showing up for service because it's a lot easier. And I don't know when.
Let's analyze that, because this is what Kaplan is going to ask us to do, is to analyze that. What is wrong with it being easier? What is the value that is lost? Maybe, let me give you an example. We have 3 holidays during the year that are referred to as pilgrimage holidays, right? So we have Pesach, we have Shavuot, and we have Sukkot. Now, these are called pilgrimage holidays because all of the Jews had to make a pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem. So I don't think so. What I asked a friend of mine, can you live stream the Hajj this year, right? From Mecca to Medina? No, you couldn't. Of course not. Because there is some sort of value in that journey, in that religious ritual. Maybe it's in your father dragging you up out of bed in the morning on Shabbat and making you go to the Dix Hills Jewish Center every morning and having that experience together as opposed to just rolling out of bed. Maybe there is a resonance in some of that journey that making things too accessible and too easy impact the overall value of what it is that we're doing. Or maybe we're making it too hard for people. And isn't the whole point of what Rabbi Kaplan is saying is we have to figure out how to make this easier and more accessible? And why are some of us here, by the way, Judah, I'm in your camp, apprehensive? Gary.
It's interesting. Most of the people in our morning minyan did not come to morning minyan out of the belief that coming to minyan, daily minyan, was a mitzvah and part of the process. They came there when someone died and they had to say Kaddish. And over 6 years doing that, I'm still going, I'd say 50% of the people who appeared that way stayed. Not everyone does. Half of them get done with their 11 months and don't want to ever have to go there again until a yort site, even then. But about half the people do stay because it meets it, as Howard said, it's a small group. We know each other. I mean, there is a value in what we do. our traditions of sharing yurt sites together and the stories of families. It's a very powerful thing. And I would, there's no way we're going to get on a regular basis 25 people in the morning when we're live. But I bet some of those people who did start coming will still come, if not every day, once or twice, a week, just because.
Why do people come back? Not stick with what works. Why try to get people to come back? I mean, wouldn't that be working in reverse then?
That's an interesting question, but on the one level, there are certain things we don't do because we are on Zoom. And I think there's a desire for that. I mean, we always have to explain the new people who come when they're mourning this year that we only get the one Kaddish at the end. We don't do all the other ones. It's wonderful to hear the Torah, but many people, as I said, want to see it. So there's a lot of things like that are missed. And I mean, I know you've talked about potentially doing a bifurcated Monday and Thursday or something, and all those things are up in the air. But I mean, I don't think just because we stopped it, we lose everyone that started, because there is something special about getting up and starting your day with a small group of people davening. And just knowing you're there as part of community.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. What about you, Don? Don, did you want to say something? Don and then Bert.
Yeah, I think that people are different, and I think some people need to go to temple and go to the whole service, and that's how they get their connection. But other people, more like me, I guess, prefer to do it from home. And other people, all the way through, so maybe some people want to do this and don't do that, or do this or don't do that. And I think that it would be good to open up so that everyone could practice in their way and still be part of the community. So in whichever way you practice, you can say, I don't eat pork, and that's all I do as a Jew. That's all I do. I do nothing else at all. But when they don't eat pork, they have a sense of their Jewishness. And if that could be included, and not say, well, now you have to do this, now you have to do that. Well, just that's good enough. And so, yeah, I think it would allow everybody to participate the way they want. I mean, I left Judaism when I was young because it was like, you had to do it this certain way. And it made no sense to me whatsoever. And everything I did after that was never, ever included. I went to the more metaphysical Buddhist kind of thing. And then I was just sort of thrown out. Not thrown out, it wasn't mean, but it was just like, well, Dawn's doing that stuff over there. But I was still Jewish. I was just expressing it, practicing it a different way. But I was just left out. That's Dawn. He's gone, and he doesn't have the faith, and he's not Jewish anymore or something. So
I think that's exactly what I'm looking. My goal, my vision is to eliminate that feeling that you aren't a part of the community, that your search is not a valid search, that your journey that you're on is not found in our ancestors and in our legends. And what I've been trying to do is work with our children and with our adults to say, Shivim Panim LaTorah, there are 70 sides, 70 faces in the Torah. And 70 is a word for infinite, okay? In the ancient Near East, 70 is to stand in for infinite. So there are an infinite amount of approaches to Torah and to Judaism. And I would like us to find a way to affirm all of that without so much of the judgment, the I'm a bad Jew thing that I hear all the time. Bert and then Alana. Oh, wait, I can't hear you, Bert.
Yeah, I came late, so some of this may have been said, but on a couple of points. One, when we're talking about kosher restaurants, for years, San Francisco has always had kosher restaurants, but they were actually Chinese Taoist restaurants, and they had the kosher certificate. And I mean, I missed them. They were wonderful places. You could go to one table and you'd see a bunch of old-time hippies. The next table would have Hasidic people. The next table would have, Chinese and orange robes. And I think, and again, this is somewhat, the Californian versus New York. I think we're the great innovators out here. And I think what happens here it may never hit, the little stables in Brooklyn, but it'll eventually, we're the ones who set that. This is my opinion as a native Californian. By the way, I interrupt myself. I really agree with everything Don said.
Me too.
And I think it's again, so I think what happens here will happen to a degree in the rest of the country. New York has its points, but I mean, I lived there for a while. I don't know, it's not the great innovator that it thinks it is.
Well, nobody, in New York, the clearest distinction I have between the Jewish community in New York and the Jewish community here is that nobody would ever belong to two shuls in New York. I mean, never am I going to belong to two synagogues in New York.
Yeah.
So this was dumbfounding to me when I heard that people belonged. Oh, I belong here. I belong to Emmanuel. I was like, what? And then I was like, at first I was like, no. And then I go, no, that's great. It required a shift in, why not? I mean, for me, it just seemed like just support these institutions, support robust Jewish life. It made sense to me. But my first reaction, is coming from this Brooklyn.
Very interesting. Because
yeah.
when I was a kid, we would go, first one thing, it's a much smaller geographically than New York, or certainly than Los Angeles. And we would go to every, the kids, you would go to every synagogue in town almost, and stand outside for the most part, and try to pick up girls, to be honest. But that was the high holidays for kids in New York. And we go to Orthodox, we go to Emmanuel, and the rest. But that's basically my point. The other thing is, again, picking up on what Don said, it's very American to want to do things your own way.
Well, that's right.
And that you put America and you put the frontier aspect of San Francisco, and you really do get everybody doing their own thing.
And that's why there it is. That's why reform is so popular here. Doesn't that make perfect sense? Reform is the one that is individualistic, and so naturally in San Francisco, reform would be where people would go to, and orthodoxy, which is very strict communitarian, would be harder to sell in this area. We're in the middle. We're trying to sell some sort of synthesis or a balance between those two because we don't like the extremes. Alana and then Dara.
Yeah, I think that, I'm thinking about what Don said, and I agree too. And it's like, how do we hold the integrity of the rituals and the traditions? And I'll just give a real life example is that relatives of mine, Dan mentioned relatives of mine wanted to say Kaddish for their mother.
I don't think I'm going to come off looking good in this story, but yeah.
No, I wasn't even going to put you in the story. And then Plony, no, just kidding. People wanted to say Kaddish, and
tell the story. It's a good story.
Tell the story. The story is that my Aunt Sherry, who recently, her yard site came up recently, she was not observant, and she did not like organized religion. I believe she had experiences that similar to Don, where it's like, you're doing it wrong, you're not part of it, or, she felt like kind of cast out. And her kids, they're like, Sherry doesn't like this stuff. We invited them to say Kaddish on the minyan, and they were like, that they didn't feel comfortable. I think one day they might, but they didn't. But they didn't know they didn't realize the yard site was on Saturday. They thought that it was like the anniversary of her death, which would have been yesterday. And my cousin's 30. She contacted me. She wanted to light the candles. I'm just like, okay, we're going to do whatever you want. I didn't tell her it wasn't happening. I'm like, okay, let's Zoom and we'll light the candle together and we'll say the Shema. But it's like, how do I hold the real, they want to mourn the loss of their mother, and they want to do something meaningful. And we're not, going to pull a ritual or something together out of thin air. Like it was that we're not going to say the mourner's Kaddish because we're not in a minyan. But it's like, how do you explain this with some humanity and grace? And like, for me, it's just like, okay, we're going to do whatever we have to kind of come up with something that is meaningful to you.
And I don't want to be some snake oil salesman who just creates some potion for the individual whenever they want to create the individual. Now, that's not how I framed your relationship with your relatives. And obviously I showed up and I participated in the ritual and we lit the candle, but I would not say the Kaddish.
That's right.
with them because it wasn't an appropriate thing to be said in the context that they wanted it to be said.
Well, the thing that's interesting though is that they didn't need the Kaddish to be said. They didn't know. Oh wait, what happened? Oh, I just lost you.
You're here. Keep talking.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. They didn't need to say Kaddish. They wanted to say a prayer. They didn't even know which prayer you're supposed to say. So once we said, oh, we can say Shema, they were happy with that. Like, I think it was just, I didn't want to be like, you did it wrong. It was last week. Yeah, you don't even know when it is. And you're saying that and you're asking for the wrong thing. It's like,
that was my response, admittedly, at the top.
No, and it was like, no, believe me, Dan came on like a hero and we participated in this call with me, with my cousins, and said Shema and led it, and everyone spoke, and it was really beautiful. But
there were five of us. There were five of us.
That's right. No, there were six of us. There were six of us, and that's fine.
Well, by the way, your comment has elicited a lot of hands. So Dara, if you could just hold your comment at the moment, and I want to take Gary, Jeff, and Marv. Gary.
Well, one of the things I really loved about this period of COVID is we've had two sets of classes. Yours on Wednesday, which takes the high level philosophical of what we do. And then we've had Rabbi Russell's, why do we do that? And I don't know many people here, there's an overlap, but I dare say there's not one person there who knew what we were doing and why. Well, I should step back from that a minute. There was one person who said, I know I do this wrong, but this has meaning to me and I do it that way. And it turned out in Rabbi Russell's class, that was the right way to do it. And this week we did Yortzites because I asked her, I said, we do things all this way. First of all, Arshul's minhag, which I knew was wrong, I thought was wrong because nowhere else does it, is wrong. But it also says, if you don't know the day, you can pick whatever day you have that has meaning and just constantly do it on that day. You just have to do it on the day you choose. And from every single thing we looked at in that class, there were things I learned that I either did wrong or didn't know. And I think it's fascinating if we continue this top-down thing about broadly philosophical and then get into the tachlis of what we actually do. It's going to be very fascinating because I know I've learned a hell of a lot.
And that's exactly where we want to go. Exactly where we want to go with this. Jeff.
You used the term synthesis a couple of minutes ago. Did you mean that literally? Because my understanding is that you regard conservative Judaism, and the conservative movement presents itself not as a synthesis, but as a continuation of traditional halakhic Judaism, unencumbered by the baggage with which Orthodoxy has saddled itself. It's not a middle ground. It's actually a continuation of tradition.
I understand. I guess what I mean in synthesis is, I'm sorry that we're not going to actually get to this Kaplan point, but Marv, hold on one second, because I want to just address, we're going to do this next week, so we can come back here next week, but it was exactly the quote. No, hold on. It was exactly the quote that I posted up on Facebook. And we'll get to this next week, but it's the synthesis between the desire for us to allow every unique individual who walks into our building to become personally and individualistically fulfilled to whatever creativity God has for them, and for us to be a conduit and a place in which they're able to fully realize that in community. Okay. And then there's the other part, which is we have to maintain the community, and maintaining the community at some point will mean establishment of some sort of norms, some sort of standards that individuals will have to comply with for the sake of the larger community. That's the balance that the conservative movement, that I'm trying to create a synthesis around, because the Bay Area is so heavily individualistic. My point is, well, you can't really figure out who you are unless you can restrain yourself. And there is part of our history with self-restraint, with what it is that we eat, with when we use our technology, with when we show up for other people, that makes demands on us, mitzvah, commandments upon us, that are not a priori, obviously, of an individualistic valence, but ultimately help us grow into the type of individual we want to be. The problem is reform is, the way Kaplan is saying, reform is just, look, it's all about however you take it. It's all going on in your head. And Orthodoxy says, who the heck are you? So I think there is a desire for what Don is saying, and as we're hearing this affirmation, individuals who can come into a community and be a part of that community without being judged for doing things wrong. And yet, we obviously want that to be the case, but first of all, I'm not even sure what that means, wrong. The fact that we have that, it's like we're talking about wrong and incorrect is also interesting. But also, we still need to maintain some semblance of community and some semblance of tradition over time, which isn't going to allow us to just defer to whomever individually walks into the building. And that we're trying to maintain both of those because we think people can learn better who they are in community. And because we at no point want the community to subsume anyone's individuality or creativity. And that ultimately has been a lot of our history. Marv.
Oh, I was going to say that in this week's Torah portion, it stresses the community, but actually in the offerings that were brought to God to build the Mishkan, it stresses how everyone brought different offerings, what they individually had. And when it came to offering your skills, you brought your individual skills.
Yes.
Yet all of it, of course, formed the community.
Well,
So
the 12 tribes. I mean, you don't want Reuben doing the job set out for Naphtali. It's just not going to be the right group of people to do that. But that doesn't mean we're not all under. They all had their own degel. They all had their own flag, and they all had their own skill set. I mean, you could view it like in a sports analogy. You don't want Tom Brady as the wide receiver. That's just not a good idea. He's really slow. He might be the best football player of all time, but you don't want him as a cornerback. It's not going to work. And so how do we figure out a way to really validate the individuals that we have in our community so they can buttress the entire community? I just want to show here very quickly. We're going to get to this next week, but I want to show this on this point. Unity of purpose, not uniformity of procedure. This is where Kaplan is going to get to. Uniformity of observance is neither attainable nor desirable. The diversity of the conditions under which different Jews live renders it unattainable, and the need to reckon with the existence of differences in personal tastes, aptitudes, and interests renders it undesirable. Unity there must be, unity of essential purpose, the preservation and maintenance of a Jewish group life that shall be experienced by the individual as making his own life as a Jew worthwhile. And that is a worthwhile vision for how we might want to have and be as a community when we return from COVID, and maybe we don't even have to wait. I mean, I've tried to be an example of openness and inclusion, to let all voices be heard, to validate all of those voices as part of the whole Klal Yisrael. And I think when we return to the shul, I think we have to continue to validate that. So not everybody has to practice the same way. Not everyone is going to practice the same way. The example that I've been giving, and I'll conclude with this one fun little test I can have you all take for me right now. You can all take this fun little test. This is the example that I've been using just to give you a brief experience of my life. Okay, so what I want you to do, yeah, you can do it too, Dad. What I want you to do is close your eyes and imagine a red square in your mind's eye. And once you see that red square in your mind's eye, open up your eyes and tap in the chat which number best represents what you saw in your mind's eye. Just tap in the chat. Which number? 6, 6, 6, 6. Any more? 6. What about you, Stuart? 2. Sandy Edwards has a 2. All right. Good. I'm a 1. I'm a 1. And Ellen is a 1. And that just means, and Howard is a 1. Oh no, Howard's a 6. It just means that there are some people who have what is called aphantasia, in which they do not picture images in their mind's eye. In fact, there's a wonderful story about the ex-CEO of Pixar who had no mind's eye, and he found some of his illustrators also had no mind's eye. It just means that when I close my eyes, I cannot see my wife's face. I cannot picture my wife's face when I close my eyes. I do not have a mind's eye. And this was very hard for me to learn a lot of the Jewish stuff that I had to be learned because it was taught through visual memorization, in particular, Torah trope and cantillations. Very challenging for me. And a lot of different Jewish things I found, as Don described it, totally alienating, off-putting, and not resonating with me because I wasn't processing in my head the same way that the instructor assumed I was. And as we look, yeah.
What about law school?
Yeah, what about law school? Law school, you know what? I always said if I did not suffer for that, I would have probably gone to Harvard. I did not do well on the one section of the LSAT, which is the visual section. There's one visual games section on the LSAT. And so I ended up going to Boston College because I did not score highly on that one visual section. But I did very well in law school, but I found a way to navigate it by, I could always think my way through a big paper. That was always the way. I was a philosophy major too. English was hard for me because whenever I read novels, I don't know what Huckleberry, do you all know what Huckleberry Finn looks like? Like I had no idea what Huckleberry Finn looks like. I had no imagery when I read fiction. So it made English classes very challenging, but it made philosophy wonderful because philosophy was a complete realm of ideas. And that's how I ended up there. So what I'm going to do, we're going to continue this discussion. We've only begun, obviously. But what we're going to do next is going to continue to think about what are the rituals. And by the way, I just want to replay back to you the rituals that you all have missed the most: hearing the Torah, carrying the Torah, dancing with the Torah, reading the Torah, and being together. I mean, pretty amazing. All very much connected to our love of Torah and our desire to be in the presence of Torah with others. We have Don. Don, one last point, and then Stuart.
Sure. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your point of view and what you're doing. It's your point of view to me is very open, high, very, very advanced. I'm wondering what, I mean, part of me going, that can never happen though, that part of me, because it's so visionary, what you're speaking, and I truly appreciate it. And me, when I listen to you, just on these ones they call, I feel more Jewish without having to do anything. Just your point of view. And one thought goes, well, I wish I had you as a rabbi when I was young. And I didn't, and that's okay because I have you now. And so I just want to say I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you, Don. Maybe we'll just end there. All right, Dad? Okay if we end there, Dad? Yeah, Dad, go right ahead.
You asked me for what I miss?
Yes,
and
what did you miss? Yeah, the tuna fish. The tuna fish. What'd you say?
Kiddush.
The kiddush, yeah, of course. Everybody, well, you know, a lot of people, some people said the kiddush, Dad.
The kiddush.
Some
Are
people
you sure
said,
you're related, the two of you?
So we're going to continue next week with Kaplan and more discussion of ritual practice because we want to actually begin to build and reconstruct a little bit. And then 2 weeks from today, we have a special guest in the right before Pesach, our district attorney, who actually had a bar mitzvah himself, I read recently. Chesa Boudin is going to be joining us here 2 weeks from today, and we are going to talk about justice and liberation on the eve of Passover. So I look forward to everybody joining us. And if you want to continue to discuss the Torah portion, where's Marv? Marv and I will be studying it tomorrow morning. Minyan starts at 7:15. You can hear Torah and you can stay after, and we'll talk a little bit about how we gather and create space for the Jews. All right?
But no Kiddush.
There you Well, you know, I'm going to take care of everybody. um,